This is Josh Siegel, an environment and energy reporter with the Washington Examiner, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion on energy and climate policy in Washington, which has really emerged as one of the key areas of interest in DC and increasingly among young Republicans, which has really been the focus of this ongoing partnership between the Washington Examiner and the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management that is putting this series on. So let's introduce the panel. We have people from across the spectrum who look at these issues. Let's start off. We have Selby Bush. She is the acting head of corporate affairs at BHP, which specializes in petroleum. And she is also an adjunct professor at the GW Graduate School of Political Management. Then we have Barnini Chakraborty. She is a senior investigations reporter at the Examiner, a colleague of mine. She previously worked at Fox News on features and political reporting, and she's done some great energy reporting for us on the ground in energy producing states. And then we have Ryan Costello. He is a former congressman from the Philadelphia suburbs, and he also is now a public policy consultant on a number of issues, including climate and energy, where he is the managing director at Americans for Carbon Dividends, which is the lobbying arm of the Climate Leadership Council. So we got all the introductions. Appreciate you all for being here with me.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, yeah. So Selby, I wanted to kick one off to you to start, just given I know that you worked with Senator Tom Coburn back in 2008. You've been around Republican politics for a long time. What do you think explains the interest of young Republicans on the climate issue right now? And did you see that back in 2008, or is it really a new thing?
So I think that's a great question. And I think that the interest in climate spans Gen Y and Gen Z. It's not just Republican voters. If you remember or think about how children were raised, recycling, climate change, talking about acid rain. I mean, I remember learning about all of these things in elementary school. And these are things that weren't discussed when generations before us were in school and growing up. And so it's something that's been very much ingrained into us. And what I'm noticing is with my nieces who are actually in Gen Z, they're more concerned about the climate probably than anybody else, in our family, multi-generations. And so I think it's not just young Republican voters. I think it's just young voters in general, and the energy and the passion that they bring, I mean, is absolutely unmatched. And so it's something that neither party can ignore. And really, we need to harness this energy to create some really meaningful and lasting change.
Cool. No, I appreciate that. That's interesting. And Ryan, from your perspective, I'm wondering, you were in Congress. This was an issue, climate, that you talked about. You're choosing to focus somewhat on it, in post-Congress. How much of that is driven by kind of what you were hearing or seeing from young people in particular in wanting to be responsive to that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Selby mentioned growing up with recycling. My first experience, I was the recycling committee homeroom rep when I was in middle school and high school, and I lobbied to get that. And by lobbied, each classroom had one. And why did I do it? Because I got to get out of the classroom right away and go around to all the other classrooms in the morning. But my point in saying that is that was my first exposure to kind of anything related to environmental consciousness, and it stuck with me. And I think that this generation, I'm 44 years old, generations younger than I are just exposed to environmental issues and climate considerations every single day. And generations preceding me were not. You kind of had to find it out. That always seeps its way into the body politic somehow, some way. And I think now, particularly with not just energy companies, not just environmentally related companies, but consumer-facing brands feel the need to explain what they're doing. and so if you are a young sort of center right oriented type of student, or if you graduated but you're in corporate America, you don't lose that environmental sensitivity and everything that you've been socialized to just because you've decided that you're not a Democrat and you're a Republican in some form. So that is now the issue is now carrying its way into the next generation of Republicans. And by that, I mean, age 45 and under. I think it remains to be seen policy-wise how that manifests itself, and we'll get into that. But to answer your question, I've seen it as an elected representative where the issue doesn't break down between Republican and Democrat in as much as it breaks down to younger voters versus older voters.
Gotcha. And yeah, as you mentioned policy, I mean, I've covered the Republicans on this issue very closely, and we've really seen here over the last few years, Leader McCarthy in the House on the Republican side has introduced this. He started introducing a climate agenda last year before the pandemic that was really focused on innovation, really harnessing the private sector and trying to kind of contrast with Democratic ideas that are, more involving regulations, mandates. I mean, Ryan, do you feel like the policy agenda as it's been presented is kind of sufficient to, to have credibility for young people who are saying this is a huge issue for me? Is what Republicans have put forward sufficient? Or, for example, I know with Americans for Carbon Dividends, you focus on a carbon price that would actually return revenues to households to offset higher energy costs. That's something economists think can really accelerate, innovation and really address the climate issue more substantially.
There's a lot of legs to that octopus in terms of my answer. And by that, I mean, if you're talking purely energy policy, then the tax credit, subsidy, accelerate innovation type policy making will prove to be insufficient if you want to reduce carbon emissions to where we would like. I represent other companies, and what they do in their space is sufficient, right? So the sustainability departments in corporate America are engaged in policy making in terms of what their footprint is. So yes and no, but writ large, you have to assume that certain sectors of the economy, the transportation sector, right, which is probably the most challenging. I think later today we see charging stations are just going to be put on steroids, which frankly is a very good thing from an infrastructure perspective. The aviation sector, which is 2 to 4% of emissions, good luck, right? There's not really an immediate solution to that. So you have to go sector by sector, and you have to go industry by industry. But for the energy sector, there probably has to, and it also depends upon where are you in the energy sector? Are you wind and solar? Are you oil? So there's a lot to it. Sorry, I didn't give you a clean answer, but it's multifaceted.
Barnini, I wanted to bring you in here as well because, the Biden administration has really leaned in on climate, not only for political reasons. This is a longstanding priority of the Democratic Party, maybe more so here in the last few years. But even before this infrastructure push, there was a lot that they did at the executive level that I know, Ryan, you're someone who tries to get bipartisan consensus, but some of these early executive moves, I know were more controversial, and we're not sure exactly what they'll mean from an emissions perspective. Barnini, you did reporting on the Keystone pipeline and the president's decision to revoke a permit. That's an oil pipeline that was going to come from Canada down into the U.S. and eventually delivering tar sands oil to the Gulf Coast. And you've done some on the ground reporting from states that are a part of where that pipeline would have been. What did you see as far as how people on the ground were understanding that policy, what they thought about it and responding to it?
Well, what we saw was we went to small towns in South Dakota, and a lot of those people were just disillusioned by DC politics when it came to the Keystone pipeline. So they felt, from our perspective, when we were talking, they said that they felt forgotten, they felt used, they felt betrayed, they felt like their lives were being toyed with. And there's just so much uncertainty from administration to administration that, they live their lives in limbo. They don't know what's coming and what's going, and they can't, and that's no way to live. You can't plan a future like that. And so I feel like what we've heard is that they just feel like they've been toyed with a lot in DC.
And were you speaking with people in the energy industry, around, people who are affiliated
We were talking with folks in the pipeline who were working with the pipelines. We were talking to folks who were in the community. We were talking with investors. We were talking with a lot of folks just on the ground and these policy decisions affected them directly. And they felt like what was happening in DC was not translating to what was happening there. And, these small towns, I mean, when I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about Cottonwood, where there was a sign that said population 9. And a lot of these towns, they've been waiting for the pipeline to come because it allows their towns to grow. It allows them to have money. It allows them to pay for schools. They don't have schools. You have to, in one of the small towns that we went to, you couldn't get groceries anywhere within a 2-hour radius. And so when they were told that the pipeline was going to come, they were really excited about it. People started investing in these communities. There was a hardware store they were very proud of. They got their first pizza place. And now that it's been shut, it's like these are ghost towns. It's crazy. It was wild to see. It was really tough.
Yeah, and Selby, that's something I hear from industry a lot, is that doing something like canceling a pipeline that doesn't really get at the demand issue. I mean, as long as people kind of need oil and gas, that maybe, from a policy level, there's different ways to address that. I mean, the carbon price is one that Ryan, is interested in that. And we're increasingly seeing industry talk about. I mean, what did you hear from clients as far as what, the Keystone decision, just did they feel like that was, damaging as far as, this increasing interest in reducing emissions, even from industry? I mean, did they maybe not see that as the best policy option?
So I think that industry's take in general on that decision, because it came with a host of other decisions, right, that were all released on the same day. And so I think from an industry viewpoint, if you take it in a vacuum, it very much felt like an attack on the industry. It was, okay, look, we're in week 1. In one case, it was, day 1. But I think that's a knee-jerk reaction. And that's natural. I think anytime someone comes and reverses policies that not only were held over from the previous administration, now sans Keystone, because that obviously was also stopped under the Obama administration, but a lot of the other policies that were either paused or stopped in those executive orders were things that have gone through, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. And so, I think the reaction, again, day 1, week 1, was, ooh, like, all right, we were expecting something, we weren't expecting this. And then I think as, the chips begin to settle, you say, okay, here's an opportunity. Here's where we can, work with the administration as an industry. But it absolutely is correct. I mean, pipelines are the safest way to transport product. So if you are going to transport that product, regardless of Keystone being built or not, there absolutely is a viable argument that it's actually going to be done in less safe ways, both for people and the environment. So I'm sorry, I feel like I've kind of danced around your question a little, but I mean, as a whole, the policies, I think, were just such a reversal from what we've seen for decades that it was a little bit of, hey, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, so now, yeah, Ryan, go ahead. What's that?
I think both women made really excellent points. Number one, and just to sort of reiterate and put a little bit of a different spin on it, there is a cultural rejection of the way that climate is oftentimes described to those in the Midwest and in the energy sector, particularly energy workers, that I think Democrats fail at. I'm sorry to be so partisan. That's number one. Number two, a lot of folks that work in the industry look at it like you're just trying to take my job, right? You're going to take my job, and what are you going to replace it with? And by the way, when you take someone's job or their job is under threat, you better darn well be certain that they know more about the issue than 99.9% of Americans, particularly cultural progressives who viewed the Keystone Pipeline as a litmus test, right? So it was viewed as, oh, this is messaging that Biden went ahead and did what progressives wanted from a messaging perspective, but it doesn't impact climate, right? So why are you taking my job on the one hand and not solving the crisis that you're saying exists, right? So you're going to take job, and so they go ahead and they do this quickly. It costs jobs. It doesn't do anything to solve climate. So that's just going to make people pull their hair out. And I think that is sort of the sum and substance of why Democrats shoot themselves in the foot, figuratively speaking, with how they engage in climate policy.
Yeah, no, that's a great transition to kind of where we are today with they're promising to create thousands of good paying union jobs and clean energy, not only in installing solar and wind, but also in building a manufacturing supply chain to for batteries and critical minerals, the materials that are used to make an electric vehicle. Ryan, do you and Selby too? I mean, maybe we can juggle here, but I mean, do you see opportunity in this for bipartisan support? I mean, some of it is kind of follows longstanding policies we've seen as far as investments and research and development, which we discussed. I think a lot of people on both sides want to see the U.S. catch up, to China and really compete on boosting our supply chains and developing technologies of the future. Are there things in here that you think we can see bipartisan support for, or is it just the way that the Democrats are coming at the climate issue so aggressively?
Yeah.
And the tax increases, it's just too much for Republicans. Yeah.
I mean, real quickly, a good reminder is they passed a bipartisan energy bill at the end of last year, right? There's a lot in there on the R&D space. Number two, I think that there are some things in this proposal that make sense. I think you'd probably get some support on the transmission side. But the challenge here is going to be the pay-fors, right? So Republicans may support some things substantively, not all of it, but this bill is likely to have a lot more spending on things unrelated to energy, and it's rolling back the tax cuts, which and I voted for the tax cuts that a lot of us felt
tax cuts, right?
Yes. That prevented corporate inversions, raised median wages, lowered unemployment, and increased labor force participation. So, Democrats spent a lot of time, hammering that bill, but there are a lot of good things in it. So, short answer, and I don't want to dominate the time, we'll turn it over to Selby. There are some opportunities for bipartisanship, but when you do a huge bill like this, it's likely that there's a lot of other things in there that don't attract bipartisanship, and those things tend to determine whether Republicans will vote for it or not.
Yeah, and Selby, similarly, I mean, do you see industry? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of interest groups involved with this package and want to see their initiatives put in there. Whether it's the advanced nuclear or carbon capture. There's all sorts of technologies that are meant. This bill is meant to progress. I mean, do you see opportunities? The industry will say we like some of this, but not some of that, or is it going to be a total rejection?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely going to see industry come out and support a lot of what is in this measure. Who from industry, I think, will be interesting. I'm sure this comes as no surprise. Industry itself is incredibly split on these issues, and it tends to be the international oil companies against the smaller independents here in the U.S. So I think it really remains to be seen. I think it makes it really tough for those members of Congress as well, because they represent employees of all of those companies. So, the political cover is there for Republicans if they want it and if they'll use it, because you do have many in the industry and business saying, look, we support this, we support the transition, we support a carbon tax, we support, tampering down and beginning this transition. But I think it really remains to be seen. And I don't think that the political environment that we're in right now is really helpful to any of this, because everything is so polarized and so partisan that it's increasingly tougher to reach across the aisle, I think, for both parties.
Yeah, you just mentioned the carbon tax. Just to circle back on that, yeah, there is this. We've seen businesses actually endorse that policy now. We've seen the American Petroleum Institute last week endorse it. It's kind of being framed as like maybe this bipartisan, in between. Okay, it does more than just R&D, but it's not as kind of potentially damaging to industry as a mandate or regulations. Ryan, do you think it's a mistake that this infrastructure bill, at least as it's written or planned, it's going to be written into legislation by Congress, but there's no carbon price? I mean, that kind of, for some people I've talked to, maybe saw that as a carbon tax. Maybe that could be a revenue, a revenue raiser for something like this. Is it a mistake that that's not in there? Were you surprised, or maybe that comes later? I don't know.
I was not surprised. They're trying to do a clean energy standard, which I think people have been trying to do for 15 years now. I'm not going to fault or point fingers when an administration in unified democratic government, right? Very narrow unified democratic government. You don't make the sort of policy choices that you do on a big bill like this without really thinking things through and calibrating it in a manner to garner the necessary votes. So for me to say it's a mistake for them not to do something, likely they've done some vote counting and there's reasons for this. I will say this, I don't think that a clean energy standard is going to be able to survive reconciliation.
Sorry, and that's a mandate that would essentially say utilities, you have to get this amount of your electricity from clean, zero carbon sources by a certain date.
Correct. And it doesn't touch upon a lot of other sectors of the economy.
Right. Electricity.
Yeah. And if you really do the modeling on it, it is not the most efficient way of going about solving the problem. But, we are a republic, we are a democracy, and, legislate. You don't always get to the finish line with the best solution. Like that's the challenge that's the nature of our government. And they've made political decisions. And I don't say the word political in a critical sense, right? I say the word political that, you got to count votes. So I won't say it's a mistake, because they have to do things the way they feel that they can get the votes for it.
Great. And Barnini, I wanted to maybe close with you and just, I feel like you do a great job of getting at kind of the human element of all these decisions that happen in DC. And, I had some conversations this week with people, in coal country and, union, groups, just kind of what they're anticipating from this infrastructure, climate initiative, and just, this level of skepticism that's out there, as much as the Biden administration, it sounds like they're really having a thorough approach to focusing on how can we create jobs in industries of the future? How do we not leave fossil fuel areas behind? Cleaning up leaking oil and gas wells that have been abandoned. As I said, the manufacturing component. So not just kind of installing clean energy, but how do we manufacture it? And that's, there's obviously a huge manufacturing basin. There was in Pittsburgh, where the president will be today. I mean, do you expect kind of a warm reception among workers to this? I mean, or is there's just, as I've experienced in conversations, it's just like, we'll believe it when we see it. How much can the federal government actually do? I mean, what's your impression?
You're exactly right. I think that they're going to be very skeptical because they thought really that they had a friend in the Biden administration earlier on. So they know that this is happening. They know that there are going to be some big changes, but right now they're just holding off and wait. And it's a wait and see approach, really. They don't really have a choice, do they, other than to accept it?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously there's a transition, happening, right? So it's just, it sounds like the Biden administration is clearly accelerating a transition to clean energy. And yeah, that's the impression I get from talking to people. It's just the pace that they're talking about, zero carbon electricity by 2035. That's gonna leave very little room for oil and gas, so it's in the economy. So it's the pace. That's what I've heard.
Same actually. Yeah.
Cool. And Ryan, would you tend to agree that maybe the challenges, as far as how workers and industry perceive this is, can we really do what they're talking about in the time frame that they're talking about?
Well, I think that workers and, I think particularly labor looks at this package and says that they have locked up, they're doing the PRO Act in here, right? Which is, you're not going to get, that's very pro-labor. And they're essentially, they are as close to doing an FDR type jobs guarantee as part of this transition as you could possibly do. And there are small p political considerations for that, because that, back to the point that Selby and I were alluding to earlier about the Keystone pipeline, you're talking about people's jobs, right? And so I think that their jobs component to this is intentional. And I think that it is intended to address, the sort of immediate concerns and considerations that you have to have when you're talking about this type of transition. I think that probably folks are being unrealistic in terms of, there is a need for fossil fuels, right? And that's kind of getting like, they kind of want to bury that, in a footnote in the middle of the document that, oh, no, don't worry about that, folks. Let's look right here. We're going to accelerate. We're going to do everything. It's going to be wonderful. Everyone's going to have a job. But if you notice, in the Republican opposition to the Clean Act, which is the House Democrats' clean energy standard, you mentioned supply chain considerations a little earlier. If you're talking about the solar industry right now, the supply chain is entirely dependent upon China. Entirely. You can't disentangle that overnight. You can't disentangle that over a year. So you can talk about a just transition, and you can talk about what you want to do here in the United States of America with clean energy jobs. But it is, you are papering over a lot of considerations that are going to become evident over the coming months as they try and get this bill to the finish line.
Cool. Well, yeah, no, it looks like we're kind of bumping up on time, but yeah, just wanted to, thank the Washington Examiner, George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management for putting this event on, and for all you in the audience for watching us, and to thank all of our guests again for taking some time. So appreciate it, everybody.